English dominance in America is not natural, it was designed. Recent events, we have a musician called Bad Bunny. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know anything about Bad Bunny. What little I have heard sounds catchy, sounds, good music, mostly in Spanish, I think. And I don't know anything about the Super Bowl or anything like that. So I'm just going to be straight up here. I'm not going to pretend to be some sort of expert on Super Bowls and Bad Bunny. Now, one figure that I am more familiar with is the Catholic commentator, political commentator, Matt Walsh. And notice how I did for Catholic. And I say that because I am questioning his sort of status as one. And I'll get into that soon. So, Matt Walsh, who essentially doesn't have a past in terms of the internet, he's erased pretty much everything there is that you could possibly find on him before he decided to go full commentator. And what little has sort of gotten out is rather disturbing. For example, an obsession with the age of consent and wanting to lower age of consent laws, or at least entertaining the proposition, again, rather disturbing. But, moving past that, Matt Walsh has criticised Bad Bunny's performance because he spoke in Spanish and sang in Spanish. And Matt Walsh said it should be in English. This is America, and we ought to do things in English. And isn't that interesting that a man with the last name Walsh is an advocate of English, speaking English? Now, this gets into a rather bizarre sort of phenomenon. So, according to the book, English Only, by Dennis Barron, it's a very good book, the tongue-tying of America, it basically gets into how sort of post-20th century, you sort of had early movements of this in the 19th century, but it really sort of took off or gained momentum or crescendo even post-World War II, in which the American government pursued intense Americanization of the public at large. And so what you saw was beforehand an America that was linguistically diverse. For example, in the Louisiana Bayou, you would have French-speaking Cajun people who were sort of, hunting and fishing while speaking an archaic dialect of French, archaic by Metropolitan standards, if you are familiar with the French language. And so that is what they erased. You had people speaking German in Texas, for example. You had the many indigenous tribes. You had Creole among many African Americans, and you also had French as well, even among many African Americans. And so there was much linguistic and cultural diversity among people that, by all means, were American. They were born and raised in America. They had grown their entire lives in America. They had spent generations in America, but nonetheless belonged to a distinct community with their own language. So, why do I bring up this history? I bring up this history to debunk this idea of an English-only nation, when in fact that was never the case. It never has been the case when you think about it. And no matter how hard the likes of Matt Walsh try, is not the case today when you think about it. But it also is something that sort of puzzles me. I'm going to explain why. None of these people were any less loyal than those that spoke English. We can see this with the rapid amount of Americans that signed up to fight for America when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Think about it. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in the sort of manner that it was by an adversary that had sort of proclaimed peace and had proclaimed a desire for peace. Many Americans of all backgrounds united together to defend their country. These were people of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, but when it came down to it, proved just how American they are. And so the idea that you need to be speaking one language, that we ought to be monocultural, and so on and so forth, is just not true. The fact of the matter is that being born and raised in a place and sort of being tied to it is sufficient enough to cultivate loyalty. Again, we can see this from the historical record. So why do I say this? Because it strikes me as bizarre that for really no benefit to the nation whatsoever, the American government would pursue a policy of Americanization, whatever that means, of the entire country, raising all of these languages and cultures essentially from existence. Now you have people trying to reclaim that heritage, but functionally speaking, it is dead. And there was no need for this. There was no need for this erasure, for this trauma, quite frankly, when you think about it. The loyalty was there. They had demonstrated their loyalty in the Second World War. And yet, that was repaid through the deliberate extinction of their community's language and of their community's unique culture. And so that is the mentality of people like Matt Walsh. It is a mentality that I cannot wrap my head around because it does not harm you. It does not harm the nation to have diversity. Diversity is simply reality. Diversity is the nature of existence. Things are diverse. Not every rose shares the same shape or colour. Not every petal has the same exact feel upon the surface. Many are soft, some have other subtleties to them. This is simply reality. And that is why I question the Catholicism of Matt Walsh, because as a Catholic, he would understand the diversity of God's family and how there is the reality of that diversity. And furthermore, like I said, it is of no harm to anyone. It is of great harm to actually abolish people's languages and cultures and so on and so forth. It is also of no benefit to the country. In fact, the country loses when they do this. America is so much poorer now because she chose to go down this dark path of English only, of making everyone essentially part of a monolith that split apart at the seams anyway. It was never going to remain the way that they wanted it to remain. But we can go further. So, Matt Walsh is a tradcon, right? Traditionalist conservative. So he talks about the importance of being a conservative. What are you conserving? Culture. Does anyone see the irony in a man who wants to preserve his culture, supposedly, advocating for the destruction and extinction of other cultures within his nation? If you are a traditionalist conservative, by default, you have to be accepting of other cultures. Because who is to say that your culture is better? Now, if he were to say, but it's tied to God and all that, then you have left culture behind, and you are reliant upon a divine mandate. You are not engaging in the original Burkean argument of the wisdom of the dead, the democracy of the dead, as Chesterton would put it, the wisdom of ages being passed down and so on and so forth. You cannot invoke that anymore, at which point you are essentially acultural when you think about it. But there is also a rather sort of nudging sinister element here, which is that if we're going to talk about original languages and an original sort of construct that America ought to be, that we cannot get past the history of colonialism. The fact of the matter is that many nations within America, the First Nations people, the Native Americans, their languages either don't exist anymore or are critically endangered. It would seem to me that the most American thing to do would be to seek the preservation and restoration of such languages, the languages of the first Americans.